There's nothing more rewarding than channeling music, as I call it. There's nothing more rewarding than you just play it in and it's done. You hear every element that's got to happen. Bill Evans called it hearing it. It's bird hearded, they say. When you hear it inside your head, it's the same as improvising a jazz solo. As it's playing, you're hearing it. As you're playing it, you're hearing it.
Dean, tell me about some of the recent projects you're working on.
This is a particularly busy time of my cycle, working on a number of shows for Discovery Channel. I have a client that does a lot of their larger specials. The current show is Red Flag, which is a 1-hour special about the Nellis Air Force Base Top Gun School in Nevada. And then shortly after that will be Alien Planet, a 2-hour special. And then Science of Star Wars, or something like that title, which will be released about the time that the new Star Wars film comes out in May. As well as those, I'm working on a number of film trailer licensed CDs. The trend in the business is to have licensed music readily available as opposed to special composed music. And for that reason, it seems like I'm being asked to write a lot more music for CDs that go out to editors and film trailer production houses ahead of time, and allows them to select from a series of genres that we write for specifically. Working with Jay Chataway on the Star Trek Enterprise series, and Jay's been the composer for the Star Trek Legacy since The Next Generation, and I'm helping him produce the score, the orchestral score in my studio. Last year I scored a show called Dinosaur Planet, and I music edited my score, and I won the Creative Arts Emmy Award for that music editing process. Funny enough, perhaps the most recognizable thing I've done is the pre-film little trailers that happen in AMC theaters. There's that little guy, his name is Flick, he wouldn't know that, but he's a guy that jumps off the Coke can, or he does all sorts of funny little antics and falls into the popcorn bin and whatnot. Well, that's my score for those 3 things: feature presentation, coming attractions, and whatever. So that was a lot of fun to do that. You hear that every time you go to the theater. Probably hear that more than you hear music from any film composer, because I'm in front of every film at AMC. In addition, I worked with John Nordstrom on the Miss Universe and Miss USA and Miss Teen USA pageants. So if you are a fan of that stuff, you'll hear me there. And the wide range of Discovery Channel things, a lot of independent features. One of my earliest breaks, let's call it, was working on the Incredible Hulk animated series, which I believe still airs now and then. I was writing a lot of music in a short period of time, and I learned how challenging the business can be from day one there. Working on a lot of trailers as a composer with Robert E. Toll Productions for quite a while, and recently the trend has been more toward licensed music. So we're doing a lot of licensed CDs that are released directly to the film trailer production houses. Essentially, we write programmatic music that can be used, for instance, for an epic action film or intimate drama. And our idea is to give the film trailer companies exactly what they need to make that 2-minute story work. If I'm writing music for a dramatic show, I believe it's my job to know the story, the film, whatever it may be, better than the director. The only way a director can really trust the composer is if he knows that composer gets the story. Music is the toughest thing for a director to talk about. They can control almost every aspect of the process up until the point where he hands the film off to the composer. And music is always the toughest thing to discuss, because what do you use? Other examples of music? Well, that's not quite what we want. Well, I want it to be a little bit more hopeful here. But oftentimes it's hard to use musical terms, obviously, if you don't play music. And it's also difficult for people to put into words the emotion that a certain scene is communicating. I was working with one director. I won't mention his name right now, actually, but it was on a film not too long ago. And it was a really interesting tense scene between two characters, and the director said, I think I want machine noise here. And I said, machine noise? He goes, yeah, just play the film. And the film goes by, and he says, okay, watch. And I was listening to that, and most people would maybe respond to that, what do you mean it's machine noise? It's a very difficult thing to interpret sometimes what people hear in their heads. And he didn't mean machine noise, certainly, but he was hearing something agitating and jarring and perhaps with discord, and maybe not too much music, not too musical, more sound designy. But it's very hard to use those terms. How do you come up with those terms unless you practice? So I said, okay, let me take a shot at this. And I come back to him with a score. It's not machine noise. And he said, that's it. But you have to be able to read between the lines. You have to be able to, it's almost like you have to be a psychologist. What are people saying versus what do they mean? And that's one of the hardest things to do in this business is taking a producer or director's vision and how he communicates or she communicates that in words, and then making that into music. Because oftentimes they won't say what they really want. So my job is to get inside the filmmaker's head, not just to understand the story, but what is the underlying story that the filmmaker is trying to tell, and to be able to communicate that back to him and say, I get it. I get what you're talking about, and I know I can make the music work for you. If he hears from me that I'm understanding his story, he'll say, okay, good. At least he understands what I'm trying to get across here. And then I'm able to go out and produce the music for him. Many times I find people who don't communicate well what's going on in the story to the director, it leaves them with a very uneasy feeling until they actually hear the music back. Well, I'm a gearhead, as many of us are. I do write at the keyboard. I have the G5 and Pro Tools, and I use Logic, and a rack of digital audio workstation PCs that run Giga Studio or Contact. And basically, I lock the picture. I'll watch the show through. I will usually try to hear the score in my head, both when it comes in and what it should sound like. And sometimes I'll start improvising. Many times I'll improvise something through. I'll sketch something on the piano, and then I'll orchestrate it out later. Sometimes the cue is driven by a sound, though, and if I find the right sound in my library, then that will sort of provide the momentum for the cue to be written. I still have my Mackie Digital 8 bus, and I use it, but I don't use it the way they wanted me to use it, probably. It's basically a big line mixer, and I'm combining all my Giga Studios, the PCs, and outboard gear and whatnot into the Mackie, and that gets fed into Logic. And so basically it's a big line mixer, it's a monitoring device, and most of my mixing is done inside the Mac, which is the trend. The way I split my studio up is I do a lot of orchestral work. The mock-up orchestra is done by the PCs. That template doesn't change very much. So there's no reason to have Logic and the Mac load up, boatloads of sounds inside the Mac if I can have it just sitting there waiting for me to use all the time. So I use the Mac for I call it swing shift. The swing shift is, drum kits and basses and special effects and ethnic instruments and whatnot. So for each specific cue, I'll have, a unique palette of sounds that comes up inside the Mac, inside Logic. To me, there are three major components of making a box sound like a person. One is obviously a big array of articulations. So for a violin sample, or a violin player, you're going to need not just a legato patch or not just a pizzicato patch, but a détaché and a marcato and a spiccato and a Bartok pizz and a number of others that if you really want to write convincing orchestral music. And you need to manipulate those effectively. And that involves using as many controllers as you can as an expression to always be writing sounds up and down, swelling them in and out. That's de rigueur, as we say, I guess. That's really important for every composer to know. You can't just play the sample and let it sit there. You have to work with it, massage it. You have to hear it as though the player played it. So you have to think like a player, and that's another subject we can talk about later. But the third, one of the most important things is the reverb, the sound of the room, getting things sitting in the right space, and finding a set of reverb samples that make the orchestra sound like it's deep is really important. I use outboard reverbs from time to time, and I also use onboard reverbs. I mean, Waves IR1 is terrific. It is intensive on the processor, so I use that sparingly. Even though the Mac G5 is powerful, I use that for my big sounds, and I'll use my outboard gear for doing smaller rooms and whatnot. One of my tricks is most orchestral people know that when you record an orchestra, you get a room sound built into it. The studio sounds like something. If it's not a big studio, that is, especially if it's not a big hall, you're going to be getting something that sounds more like a medium room or a large room. And then what most engineers do is they'll put a larger hall sound on top of that. Well, I try to emulate that process by always putting a room sound on my orchestral samples, so they sound like they're sitting in the same room. Then I layer another larger hall sample on top of that. So ideally, you'd run your stuff, your samples through the room, and then that combined sound through the hall. Wielding the power of those samples, wielding all those articulations is a formidable task if you've got, like I do, 10 or 11 gigastudios or different PCs doing your job for you. So how do you do that? You have a whole rack of tracks. Do you have, like in Logic, I used to have probably 15 tracks just for violins. So you're playing a line, and if the articulation is arco at first and then it jumps to marcato, you got to stop and you got to switch tracks. Or you got to play it in and then copy and paste from one track to the next so that the right samples are being triggered. Well, that wasn't satisfactory to me. So I have devised a system whereby using an outboard, a separate small keyboard that has 37 notes, I use that to essentially key switch between all the sounds in my studio in real time, if I want to, without changing tracks. So that, to me, is the solution that helps me be creative in real time, to not have to switch tracks, stop the flow of my creativity. Also solves a number of other problems that composers often have, which is, what if you want to print a score out? Well, you got to combine all these tracks into one common track. You got to get rid of any MIDI key switching that's done, because those MIDI notes that you use to key switch between samples often create a problem in scores. So once you combine everything down into this one track, then you can print a score out. Well, I've got one track for violins, and if I want to print it out, it's printed out. Also, I like to look at the score in Logic while I'm recording, while I'm composing. Well, it's hard to look at 15 tracks and figure out what you've just written, or to try to tweak it. Well, if you have one track, then you can look at a score with first violins, second violins, violas, cello, and bass, and you can see what you just wrote without having to worry about dressing it up for printing out for a score, without having to worry about those MIDI key switches that I did. See, I use a technology that doesn't put those MIDI notes into the score. So it's something I might be marketing at some point in the future, but for the time being, it's really helping me get my job done much more quickly.
Do you do the stereo mixes? What happens on the mixing and mastering process?
Yes, depending on the timetable. I'll bring an engineer in if I have the time and I really want to tweak a certain cue. But generally, I'm writing music up until the day of the dub. So until the night before, at least, and sometimes on the day of the dub. So I'm mixing it myself. And these days, to get things to cut through on TV, some mastering is needed. I'll send cues out without mastering, and it just, yes, it sounds more natural. There's dynamic range. It sounds clean and beautiful on my speakers, but you listen to it on TV and it doesn't cut. So I hate to say it, but I use quick and dirty mastering solutions, and thank goodness for Waves, because the L3 is something that absolutely is essential to making my orchestral sounds, in particular, pop out without coloring them. I've used other mastering quick and dirty programs, and they, yes, make it sound louder, they make it sound more present, enhance the sound overall, but it sounds colored. It sounds different than what I intended. The L3, just with a very simple, small amount of processing, just minimal settings, if you just run the master mix through it, it really enhances the overall sound, and it sounds clean and clear.